Okay, so as always, it's kind of slightly difficult being the second sort of philosopher, so to speak, because, you know, obviously your philosophical colleague has already said largely what you were going to say, but both better and with arguments that are strong enough to break glasses and things. So, you know, I lack, I have to say, I put small sort of charges underneath the tables to go off at select moments, but it won't be the power of my mind that is doing it, or my argumentation. So I'm going to be focusing on, I guess, the question of, well, what's the point? You know, why do bioethics? Why bother talking about it? And I guess to sort of start off with a confession, this is slightly odd for me to be doing this insofar as I am not European, so talking about European bioethics is perhaps slightly cheeky. And also I don't generally consider myself or describe myself as a bioethicist, so I usually would describe myself as a political philosopher who dabbles around in applied ethics an awful lot, but not restricted to perhaps what we might think as kind of the classic areas of bioethics, not necessarily just the biosciences, but I'll put my fingers into many pies as I can possibly get them into. So I'm going to be kind of coming at it from, well, what should we consider bioethics to be about? And also, I don't use PowerPoint very often, so I always slow and bad at using it. So I thought, given that I come from the other side of the world, I'd start off with a quote from the other side of the world just to mess with you. And so, mai ko ki aha he aha te mea nu o te ao maku e kia atu he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. Which translated means roughly, ask me what is the greatest thing in the world. I will reply, it is people, it is people, it is people. And so the sort of modern Bart Simpson equivalent of this would be, it's people, stupid. So I think kind of what I would suggest is kind of a core focal point, something that's easy to kind of neglect and forget about, is, and I guess it's again back to the kind of ethics side of bioethics. One kind of focal point is that what we're concerned about is in some way benefiting or at least avoiding harming or doing something around the notion of things that are good for people in some way, shape or form. Now, what I'm going to try and do in the talk is largely argue that we ought to adopt the second model that Becky quite nicely outlined for us. And so I'm going to try and argue that thinking that it's focused around people and benefiting people gives us a reason for ultimately coming to something like that kind of position. Okay, so the point, as I said, making people better off in some way, doing right by them, or at least minimizing harm to them. There's lots of different ways we can get there. So I've kind of outlined 4 different sort of paths of how we might get to kind of benefiting people in various ways. And I've kind of roughly tried to go for kind of caricature positions. So we've got the kind of the theorist, whether they're a philosopher or a sociologist or another sort of theorist, cultural theorist or whatever. The point is kind of figure out the truth, figure out the right answer in some way, shape or form. And I've said kind of characteristically the philosopher wants to be kind of left alone in their cave to think with no intrusion from the kind of horrible outside world and its dang empirical evidence coming along and messing with us is kind of the caricature view. And then likewise you've got somebody who takes a kind of very evidence-based approach. So the point is really to gather data. And this is again the caricature of the social scientist, right? What they want to do is be left alone, annoying theorists aside, to measure things, right? That's what it's all about. And then you've got another camp, the policymakers. So the point is really to change things and to change things at kind of the highest level. So the sort of policymaker, the lawyer, the aim is again to kind of influence, create change in various ways, and preferably without interference from either of those annoying people who care about evidence or those annoying people who care about theory. Really, it's all about making sure changes happen, right changes. And then, kind of final point is, I guess, sort of activists. So the point is to kind of change things from almost the kind of bottom up. So it's kind of, to sort of paraphrase the classic quote, philosophers, and I'm going to add sociologists, aim to understand the world. This chap's out to change it. Right? That's the important thing. Okay. So, we've got these sort of 4 different points of view, and you kind of often encounter them in workshops like these, and I will often play one or more of them, depending on what I'm feeling like, because sometimes it can be kind of interesting to see what happens if you push the argument from a particular perspective. But what I kind of suggest is that, although that can be fun, it's not necessarily all that helpful. So the sort of the silo approach to things, I think, is never going to kind of work. And I've got a poem which I found, well, actually my wife read to me and I went, yeah, that really works for exactly what I want to say. So apologies, it's very different from me. But there's an American poet called John Godfrey Sachs. You're probably vaguely familiar with the poem, and I've edited it a little bit to kind of get the point across, but it still works. So it was 6 men of Indostan, to learning much inclined, who went to see the elephant, though all of them were blind. That by observation might satisfy his mind. The first approached the elephant and happened to fall against his broad and sturdy side. At once began to bawl, God bless me, but the elephant is very much like a wall. The second, feeling of the tusk, cried, Ho, what have we here, so very round and smooth and sharp? To me 'tis mighty clear, this wonder of an elephant is very like a spear. The third approached the animal, and happened to take the squirming trunk within his hands, and thus boldly up and spake, I see, quoth he, the elephant is very like a snake. The fourth reached out an eager hand, and fell about the knee. What most this wondrous beast is like is mighty plain, quoth he. 'Tis clear enough the elephant is very like a tree. The fifth, who chanced to touch the air, said, E'en the blindest man can tell what this resembles most. Deny the fact who can, this marvel of an elephant is very like a fan. The sixth no sooner had begun about the beast to grope, than seizing on the swinging tail that fell within his scope, I see, quoth he, the elephant is very like a rope. So these men of Indostan disputed long and loud and long, each in his own opinion exceedingly stiff and strong, though each was partly in the right, and they were all in the wrong. And so the moral is, so often bioethics discussions, the students, I ween, wail on in utter ignorance of what each other mean, and prate about an elephant that none has ever seen. Right, so it's a kind of another way of putting across the point that Becky was making, I take it, that you could often get a situation where everybody is right, in their field, in their area. They're absolutely right. That's what bioethics is about. That's what's going on. That's what's important. And they're all wrong, because they're failing to see that bigger picture. Right? And presumably that's what, insofar as we favour things like interdisciplinarity, that sort of thing, that's what interdisciplinarity is supposed to sort of solve or get us answers to. I think it doesn't necessarily do that. I think there's various reasons it doesn't. One reason it doesn't is that we tend to have certain attitudes towards respectfulness which I think are in some ways unhelpful. So often respectfulness is taken to mean that guy goes on about his cultural theory stuff, and that girl goes on about her, philosophy stuff and whatever. Now it's my turn to talk. Right, so respectfulness is kind of about not interrupting and not questioning and not challenging. Right? It's a kind of tolerance-based respectfulness. And I always suggest that actually the kind of respectfulness we need in this kind of criteria is precisely the opposite. Right? What you've got to do is take people seriously on the basis of their own disciplines, but also your own, and actually put forward challenges. Say, well, surely don't you, if you say that, doesn't that imply that? So the kind of what happens with the, if we say the fetus has no moral status whatsoever, right? It's a good question to ask. Well, if you say that, well, surely that implies you could do this, you could do that. And it's useful if somebody asks that, regardless of whether they're a moral philosopher or not. That's the kind of point. Okay, so to put that back into the kind of terms that I was using before, the theorist, well, without evidence and implementers, the theory has got, in modern British terms, no impact. Right? We can't write about why we're so great. I'm really happy now you've got a perfect kind of REF submission here. Your research now has serious impact, right? You can shatter things. The impact of your argument. That's got to be worth something. Likewise, the empiricist, without a theory, well, how do you know what data is relevant? Why do you want to know about things unless you've got some kind of theoretical things? And without somebody to kind of implement things, what's the point? Right? All the data in the world, it's irrelevant unless we can use it to change things and make things better in some way. Likewise with the policymaker, well, if you don't have the evidence and you don't have a good theory, how on earth can you make good policy? Right? You've got to kind of identify what the goals of the policy are, and telling that's going to be very difficult without those other things. And likewise, with a kind of activist. Well, why advocate for change